Hey, I'm Nick DiMatteo, and welcome to Season 8, Episode 19 of Music is Not a Genre. Ready? MxG. Thank you, as always, for watching and listening. This week's topic, the visuals, Part 2, band logos. And yes, there's a mid-roll, so I don't have to do a whole lot of promotion here, except to say, as I said last week, please tell people about this podcast. The more you spread the word, the better. If you're a listener, thank you so much. I have a lot of listeners all over the world right now, which is really nice. If you are a listener, go to youtube.com/@musicisnotgenre and subscribe, because not only do you get a video for every episode of this podcast, you get a lot of other things that I do too, commercials and voiceovers and a bunch of other things. And you'll help me grow my family on YouTube as well. But enough of that. Let's get back to the topic. This is the visuals Part 2, band logos. Now, it's Part 2. Why? Because Part 1 was on album art. I did that a few weeks ago. Talked about some significant albums from throughout the decades and where album art came from. And I was going to do all the art together and realized, no, I can't fit that in the one episode. So I separated them out, and I'm doing band logos, which, by the way, if you are just listening, you're missing out on the fact that I am wearing one of my t-shirts with the new Rec logo. I'm going to move for a second. You can see the new Rec logo there. I have a video of all of the Rec logos throughout history, which is actually a featured item for this episode. And you'll get to see that if you're watching at youtube.com/@musicisnotgenre. And if not, go to youtube.com/@recmusicnyc, and you can see it there. I think it's Rec Music NYC. I always forget. So this is the band logos episode. I have been obsessed with logos in general since I was a child. First for brands and companies, things on TV, items in the house, whatever, items in magazines, etc., and then bands. Then big-time bands. I started designing logos very, very early on, and I managed to actually get one placed for a college organization that was part of Rutgers in my teens. So, I've been designing logos for a really long time, and I think successfully so. I didn't know. I have designed dozens of logos for various reasons: music, my band, other people's bands, film, books, companies, even organizations, including all the logos for all of my artist names, which are Rec, The Drop, and Nick. And again, Rec has 3 brand new logos, not just the one on my shirt, which I believe I call Rec Punk, but there's a little guy Rec, and then there's like a blast Rec. I don't know what you would, TNT Rec, whatever you want to call it. And you can see them all at nickdimatteo.com/shop. So please go there, check out the logos, and if there's some t-shirts you want, please get them. And they are soon going to be featured on some albums and singles and stuff like that. So this is all about great logos, band logos through the history of music. Show format, first, the history of logo art in general, notable band logo art by decade, conclusions, questions, and then, if not a featured song, that featured video I talk about, which is Rec's history through its logos, our 20-year history through the change in logos, and a little discussion, like little blurbs about the history from, 04 or whatever the first logo was until now. And it's accompanied by a song off of Rec's latest album, Cite to Camden, which I'll talk about that later. And so for you listeners who can't see these logos, I'm doing 2 things. First, I am including the song at the end of this as a featured song. It's called Linear B, Other Side. And so you at least get to hear something, get a flavor. That's one of my favorite songs from the new album. And the second thing is I'm including the link to the video in the text. Wherever you're listening to this, go down to the text. You'll see that featured video link. You can check it out there on YouTube, on Rec's channel on YouTube. And, of course, the bonus MxTRA at patreon.com/musicisnotagendre. is an interesting one. It's the history of solo artist branding, which has been different from band logos in a few key ways, as I discovered when I did my research and felt it deserved a separate section all its own. That's the bonus MxTRA at patreon.com/music is not a genre. Sources: Google, Wikipedia, Not So Modern Drummer, and you'll see why I needed that as a source, 1000logos.net, and Reddit, believe it or not. So some disclaimers. Again, I'm going to miss a ton because this is just a sampling, but I believe that my samples are a great cross-section for each decade. The biggest disclaimer, again, as for part 1, and I've alluded to this already, which is, you listeners, you know I love you. I, in some ways, prefer it. Podcast is a listening experience. Almost every podcast I take in is the audio version. This case, however, I recommend that you pause this and go to youtube.com/@musicisnotagenre and watch this episode instead of listen to it, because I will feature every logo that I talk about. You get to see the art. All right. You can look them up too if you're just listening. So make a list of the bands that I talk about as far as great logos, and you can check them out online. They're pretty damn easy to find. But again, recommend you go to youtube.com/@musicisnotagenre. Let's get into it. So, the history of band logos. Let's do a quick history of logo art in general. As I mentioned, I may be more of a fan of logos than of any other mass-produced art, including album art. I'm more interested, frankly, in the logos than the album art, by a hair at least. A great logo can capture exactly what a company or entity is and even add depth to its meaning and purpose. And I say company or entity because that's where logos first began. Prehistorically, things like seals, crests, coins, coats of arms could be considered logos. Concise one-image visual representations of something that were meant to evoke the family, the whatever, the monarchy, all of that. The first actual business logo, one with deliberately simplified and abstracted graphics, was put in use in the 1870s by the Bass Beer Company. That red triangle that represents Bass with the name Bass under it, 1870s. First legit logo in business. From that point on, every business worth its salt came up with a logo. Now, there may have been, another podcaster always says, there's no real first. Probably true. I'm sure there were logos prior to the Bass, but as far as the first prominently known one, it was the 1870s. But since this isn't a history of general logos, I'm going to leave business logos at that and skip ahead to music. Just assume that from the 1870s on, almost every company had to figure out how to way to have a logo, a stamp, a mark, right? As we just learned, it took the recorded music industry quite a while to incorporate visual art. That was from the other part of this series, part 1, album art. I talked about how first 20, 30 years of the recorded music industry, they didn't care much about how the recording looked. That didn't really start to happen in a big way until the 50s. So it's no surprise that it took even longer for band logos to pop up because they have a different reason for existing. You can't quite count sheet music or even early recording labels because the names of those artists were little more than versions of whatever typeface they were using, larger, maybe stylized printing. And that was almost always, though, reserved for the song title, even rather than the artist. When you think of a piece of sheet music, it's the song title that's the most prominent, not the artist. I'd argue that the first actual band logos were on something you might not even be thinking of when you think of a logo, and that is the drum heads for kick drums. And as soon as I say it, you're like, my God, of course. So even though they weren't used in printed materials for decades, drum heads have had band and artist artwork since at least the 1920s. And up until the 1940s, the pre-television era, that was the main place to see logo-ish art. Other kinds of art did pop up, like paintings, elaborate paintings, things that evoke the kind of mood. It was almost like having an album cover on the drum head, but for the most part, they were symbolizing the name of the band or the name of the band itself or a picture of the artist or something like that. They were like, for example, Abe Lyman used to display the opposite of that, I should say, which is actual paintings. Most though were stylized names of the artists or some other representations. Some few examples to illustrate this early kind of logo-ish use on drumheads. Paul Whiteman, as early as the 1920s, he displayed an almost caricatured drawing of his head on the bass drum. I couldn't find a good enough photo of the drum, but that same image was also on some of his recordings. So you people watching, what you're seeing is from one of his recordings. It was the same image that was used on his drumhead. Chick Webb in the 1930s also had a sketch of his head with a crown on it, which I think is fun. It's cartoonish, but in a fun way. Lester Daniels and his swing band in the 1930s was clearly stylized name meant to be special, almost logo-ish. The Dorsey brothers, Jimmy and Tommy Dorsey, in the 1940s, they started together earlier as the Dorsey brothers in the same band, and when they split, they each had their initials prominently displayed in the drum kit, so JD or TD, in stylized. That's a logo. And you can say something similar, and not so much the initials, but, in terms of the art, the logo-ish art, about Duke Ellington, Glenn Miller, Count Basie, and all the big band leaders. And this eventually translated directly to the modern music era, especially when TV came in, especially. Some artists used stylized fonts to represent their names in the 1950s. Elvis being a big one, Sinatra, Ella Fitzgerald. And this is what I'm going to talk about partly in the bonus MxTRA at patreon.com/musicisnotagenre. What different things did solo artists do, and have they done since then to represent themselves artistically as opposed to logos? And it wasn't really until the 1960s when these stylized names evolved into band logos. And as usual, you can credit the Beatles, if not for the actual first of things, then at least for the massive first popularization and upscaling of the quality of things. And I may do an episode on that, how a lot of people say the Beatles were first at XYZ when they weren't necessarily first, but they either did it in the most popular way or the best way or whatever, and they influenced everyone else to do it. And in this case, what I'm talking about is that stylized Beatles logo with the drop T, T longer than everything else. Yes, it was made for Ringo's drum kit. It was for the drum head, but it was eventually used on a lot of their merch. Which brings us, of course, to the real fun. Great logos by decade. Notable logos by decade. Let's start with 1960s, inventing the image. I'm going to put a little name for every decade because I always like naming things. Say what you want about iconic bands from this decade, but there were still very few who had any kind of consistent logo or branding. Look through albums and other print from these bands, and though you'll find consistency in vibe, playful, all menacing or psychedelic, whatever. You think Jefferson Airplane's flowing and colorful name, or Cream's thick round lettering, or the Kinks' skewed bold lettering, almost punk. You'll find little to no indication that they were thinking about one or two pieces of art representing them on the whole. But here are some exceptions. Excuse me, 1963, as early as this year, the Beatles were using that drop T logo, designed by Ivor Arbiter, maybe? I'm going to take a drink as you listen to me gulp. I'm not editing that out. You get that for free. In 1964, The Who started using their arrow logo with the H's connected. It was designed by Brian Pike. It was never actually used on their albums at the time. Eventually later it was. But on tons of promotional material and shirts and stuff, stickers maybe, did not at the time include the target behind it. If you're wondering why that's not there. That was added in the 70s and 80s. 1967, the Doors were actually relatively consistent with their logo, those outlined, almost industrial letters designed by Bill Harvey. And in 1969, the Grateful Dead had many logo type things throughout their career, the bear being a big one, which we'll talk about. But their first was the Steal Your Face skull with the lightning bolt on the forehead, designed by Owsley Bear Stanley and artist Bob Thomas. And that's the 1960s. Not many, like I said. And then now we get to the 1970s, symbolizing the source. That's my name for it. As with so much of music culture, the stuff born in and often strongly associated with the decade before actually came to fruition the following decade. Go back to my album series and you'll find the, idea of an album as a work of art kind of started in the 1960s, didn't come to fruition until the 1970s. The 1970s is really where logo ideas took hold as well, and from that point on, it became almost necessary for all bands to have logos. As a side note that, again, this would not spread to solo artists, not much at all. Bowie and Elton John had styles that were consistent, as consistent as they needed to be, but no consistent logo. And again, I cover this in the bonus MxTRA at patreon.com/musicisnotagenre. Solo artists, along with the iconic logos I'll mention, there was a ton of iconic art, which I mentioned a lot in the previous episode of this series on album art, such as Pink Floyd's Prism or Led Zeppelin's Zoso symbols, runic symbols, or Earth, Wind, and Fire's Egyptian symbolism. Not going to go over that here. So, 1970, the band Chicago. Though their first Chicago Transit Authority album the year before had a proto version of their incredibly iconic logo, it wasn't until the second album that both their name and their logo congealed into what it will remain forever. So far, anyway. The cool thing is that from the beginning, they were able to be both consistent and diverse, keeping the exact design and shape of the name and changing its vibe and aesthetic for each release. They have been an inspiration for a ton of bands to do this, whether the bands know it or not. And they have definitely been an inspiration for me for changing the Rec logo for every release. Now, I do it differently. I do it more in kind of a modern sense, more other contemporary bands do. But it's partly because I saw, Chicago had a somewhat of a different logo for every album. I'm going to do that. That was designed and drawn by John Berg and Nick Fasciano, respectively, to be reminiscent of the Coca-Cola logo. Now, when you look at the Chicago logo, you will never not see the Coca-Cola logo as well. Same year, 1970, Rolling Stones, the tongue and lips logo, which is probably one of the most iconic of this entire episode, was designed by John Pache, I believe, or Pasche, I don't know, Pasche. It is still on t-shirts worn by people of all ages today. And I know you can see it in your head, even you listeners. 1972, yes, Roger Dean, the legend, designer, graphic artist in general, still working. Organic and flowing bubble letters. It was designed in 71 and first used on Close to the Edge in 72. There have been many variations, but like Chicago's logo, it's kept fairly consistent shape. Slight more changes than that, but yeah. In 1973, Kiss, the name, designed by Ace Frehley. That lightning bolt SS at the end, an overall sharp and aggressive, it's smartly simple design. Hard to forget. I can see it in my head and just looking at it now. Side note that just like Grateful Dead and many other bands before and after, many of these logos were designed to be stickers put on equipment so they could keep track of it at gigs. And I'll talk more about that later on. And 1976 or 77-ish, let's say, Motorhead's War Pig, known as Snaggletooth, designed by Joe Patano, in collaboration with Lemmy himself. I mean, I love that guy, you know. Side note and it's really one of the first bands to create not a name thing, but like an entity, an animal or person that represented the band. Other bands would do this too. Side note that though you can't consider something like this a logo, the fact that so many hardcore or music or metal bands started using umlaut everywhere is clearly a visual cue. That's not a logo, but it is a visual cue. And they were, sometimes discriminate, sometimes indiscriminate. And it works so well. As soon as you see an umlaut, you're thinking it's probably hardcore music of some sort. And think, here's some bands. Blue Oyster Cult with the umlaut over the O for oyster. Queensryche, the Y has it. Motorhead, the second O has it. The Accused, the U has it. Motley Crue, the O and the U. Husker Du, both U's. Or, if doing it ironically, like Spinal Tap with the umlaut on an N, which makes no sense if you know anything about German, and Green Jelly with it on the Y, because why not? 1977 AC/DC, speaking of lightning bolts, replacing the usual slash between those with that lightning bolt, making the lettering overall very high voltage in energy. It was designed by Gerald Huerta. 1977, same year, the Ramones, looks like a presidential seal to kind of mock the seriousness of punk. It was designed by Arturo Vega. It first appeared on their second album, though it was designed in 1975. In 1978, Van Halen's often mimicked, parodied, lovingly or not, Think of Weezer. Winged VH. It was not on every album, but it was on a ton of merch and on some albums, and consistent enough that almost anyone could identify it to this day. And when you think of a Van Halen graphic, that's probably the first one you think of. And it really, even though it was 78, it kind of foretold what was going to happen in the 80s. Designer, Dave Bong. Speaking of, the 1980s, branding the business. Like with so much else in the 1980s, logos were proto-futuristic, capitalizing on the ubiquity of synths and drum machines. So logos went from more hand-drawn to more mechanical, and more than ever aligned with the artist the way a brand logo aligns with a product. The 80s were kind of the peak of that. Again, not with solo artists. They didn't quite pick up on the logo thing, but by this decade, they were starting to understand that an artistic identity and even persona were going to catapult them to greater heights, so they got more consistent with their style and branding and iconography, while still not really getting into logos and or many reusable symbols. And again, I talk more about that in the bonus MxTRA, patreon.com/music is not a genre. What made the biggest impact on logos in the 1980s was the subculture rising, in particular metal and hip hop. It wouldn't fully rise until the next decade, but they were there enough to influence the culture, and that so many logos were being designed by somebody in the band. It got personal. It was the rise of the auteur, you know. While I said that Chicago was a huge influence on Rec's logo trajectory, the 1980s were when I really fell in love with band art, and that was almost exclusively because of metal and hip-hop bands. So, for example, 1980, Iron Maiden. I'm sort of fudging on this because they did their hugely iconic logo on a 1979 demo, but their 1980 debut album and beyond is when it really took hold. So I'm going to call it an 80s thing. It was designed by the bassist, somebody in the band, Steve Harris. Industrial, angular, and sharp lettering. This band was a huge influence on my love of both logos and album art. Why? Because a friend of mine who sat in front of me in some of my high school classes would wear their shirts often, and I once spent an entire class sketching the back of his shirt for the Number of the Beast, including their mascot, Eddie the Head. And coincidentally, that friend's name was also Eddie. 1981, Def Leppard, designed by Alan Schmidt. It's a similar fudge because it was actually designed and debuted in a 1979 single, but their second album, High and Dry, is really when it took hold. And a version was on their first album too, but it wasn't quite the same. So we're going with this 81. It was similarly angular. You needed to be angular if you were heavy metal, which was a kind of a contrast, a reaction against Chicago and Yes and those kind of flowing logos. 1982, Metallica, designed by who? Some obscure person, a graphic artist named James Hetfield, for their very first demo. I think it was inspired by a combination of the Van Halen and AC/DC logos because it is reminiscent of both. Harsh, bold lettering with the extended M and A on each end, the Metallica. 1983, this is not a band, but worth mentioning, the Def Jam Records logo. Big block lettering with the interlocking D and J, the J kind of tickling the D's underside, designed by Rick Rubin. Again, somebody in the band, basically. It was everywhere. It was iconic. It was hugely influential on other hip-hop logos, as you will see as I go through this history, that minimalism of the Def Jam logo and the starkness and, directness. It's very influential. 1985, Run DMC, using Franklin Gothic block lettering in white with red bars in the top and bottom. And a lot of these logos did change their colors based on the context, but that was the first. First appeared on singles that year and then on albums and in videos after that. It was minimalism with power. 1986, Public Enemy, the silhouette of a guy in crosshairs, and that guy was LL Cool J's DJ E-Love. Along with the stencil-style military lettering, immediately clues you into the kind of music you're about to listen to, and it was designed by none other than Chuck D. These next couple are more associated with later decades, but did actually debut in the 1980s. So 1989, Red Hot Chili Pepper, it was when you think of the asterisk, everybody still wears it. People still wear it to this day. It's that iconic. It was actually designed by Anthony Kiedis in 1984 at the label's request. So it had been around since then, but not on any of their recordings. It was used on merch and such. It wasn't used on any official recording until 1989's Mother's Milk. And the asterisk has been called Star of Affinity, Navajo Sun, or my favorite, Angel's Butthole. It was been intermittently used on their recordings since then, but on their merch everywhere. A lot of times they'll go with something more punk or hand-drawn, which is a real aesthetic of one part of their music. So you wouldn't see the logo on everything that they did. But when you think of Red Hot Chili Peppers, that's the first logo you think of. It's one of the few band logos that's endured even beyond people who wear the tees really knowing the band that well. And it became far more ubiquitous and iconic in subsequent decades, and it's not really associated with the 1980s, but it did start, again, sometime in the 1980s. Slight variations in color, etc., but it's almost always a mix of black, white, and red. And another iconic one, 1989 debut, 9 Inch Nails. That black and white NI and backwards N with top and bottom bars, designed by Trent Reznor and also Gary Talpas. Again, people in the band. Industrial minimalism. It bridges rock and electronic just like the music does. It leans more towards contemporaneous hip-hop logos even. Pretty much everyone still knows it and had more impact in the 90s and beyond than when it was debuted. Speaking of, the 1990s, subverting the shine. As with everything else in the 90s, and as you learned a couple weeks ago, whenever I debuted my Producers of the 90s, the thing was the anti-thing. So, for example, stage presence was anti-presentational, but still a very deliberate choice. Clothing was anti-fashion, which again is a choice. And of course, the iconography was again anti-branding, and ironically, some of the best branding ever. So, 1991, Nirvana's smiley face kicked off and defined the decade, at least the first half of the decade, the same way their music and fashion and stage presence did. It was said to be designed by Kurt Cobain, but actually probably designed by a label art director, Robert Fisher. And it's often displayed in a sickly yellow color, but not always. 1991, Pearl Jam. The Stickman, or also known as the Alive Guy, because it was first used on the Alive single, was designed yet again by a band member, Jeff Ament. Meant to be affirming and energetic. I'm alive, hands in the air, very punk line art in a way that I am very familiar with. Again, go to nickdimatteo.com/shop and you're going to see a lot of awesome punk line art that you can't get anywhere else. 1992, Aphex Twin is some weird amorphous A, kind of an alien A with an extension at the top, all in a circle. It's a mix of graphic arts, clear lines and blotchiness. Designed by Paul Nicholson, who is Aphex Twin, the year before. Interesting because this band, I'm sorry. Paul Nicholson is not Aphex Twin. Paul Nicholson is the designer. This band is actually one person, Richard David James, is Aphex Twin. And very rare that somebody like that would use a logo. Again, bonus MxTRA, patreon.com/music is not a genre. All the solo artists. 1992, Weezer, the ironic flying winged W, which is a Van Halen ripoff designed by drummer Patrick Wilson, used on select merchandise and for a demo that year, and then it really broke out the following year. And like many, but not all of these logos, it was featured on the drumhead. So the more, that's happened for over and over again. Any of these logos I mentioned, some of them have been featured on the drumhead, just like in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and beyond. 1993, Wu-Tang Clan, that iconic bubble butt W is one of the, and with the sharpness at the top, it is one of the most recognizable and widely worn logos to this day. I've seen it on hats to like this year. Designed by Ronald Maurice Bean, also known as Mathematics or A La Mathematics, the group's official DJ and producer. It has that minimalist feel, but with a mystical flair. 1993, Korn. Frontman Jonathan Davis designed it with his left hand to make it deliberately childish, and the backward R helps with that, and the jagged lines also help too. We're going to get to the end of this decade, and then we're going to take a break. 1996, a guy named Nick. I started designing, logos for my music. Then it wasn't the first logo I designed in general, but for my first music logo, it was Nick. And what I did was that little extension at the end of the K, and the deliberate font that I used, font, typeface, whatever. 1996, possibly more associated with the 2000s, but designed and used as early as this year by drummer Joey Jordison. It's a primitive, scary scrawl that's easily recognizable and repeatable. I forgot to put down what band that was. Joey Jordison died in 2021. Was that? Oh, shoot. Anthrax? I don't know. No, I don't think so. Oh, my God. Well, look it up. That's my mistake. I've been producing a lot. 1997, you'll see it on the screen. Those you watchers, you'll see the logo there. 1997, Daft Punk, like it was scrawled by a machine. It's raw and futuristic all at once. It's often stylized as liquid metal. It was designed by Guy Manuel de MxTRA, or Guy Manuel de MxTRA. Most other artists, including and especially solo artists, deliberately stayed away from any single logo or icon, instead switching it up for each album based on the mood and sound. Yet they stay consistent within a certain aesthetic. For some examples are Green Day's hand-drawn graffiti-ish punkiness, very close to my heart. The White Stripes started with their black, white, and red theme in the late 90s. From the get-go, visuals changed with each album, but the color aesthetic stayed the same throughout. And then solo artists like Bjork and Tori Amos maintained a vibe while always morphing. And again, bonus MxTRA, patreon.com/music is not a genre. I go into how solo artists have represented themselves visually in ways other than logos, every now and then including logos. And with that said, we're going to take a break, and we'll be right back with the 2000s. Stick around. Hey, MXG fans, thank you as always for watching and listening. Listeners, go to youtube.com/@musicisnotagenre. You get a video for every episode of this podcast. Watchers, go to nickdamadio.com/musicisnotagenre if you would rather just listen. And everyone, please take some time out to go to patreon.com/musicisnotagenre to support this podcast, my band rec, and everything I do for as little as $1 a month. Speaking of everything I do, nickdamadio.com really does have it all. If you're interested in unique and quirky t-shirts that I've all personally hand designed, go to nickdamadio.com/shop and you can find it all there, including discounts if you sign up for my newsletter or Patreon. If you're someone who's always wanted to write a song, has just never figured out how to get there, let me work with you. I am the Song Coach. Go to nickdamadio.com/thesongcoach, and whether you're a complete beginner or completely advanced, I can get you there. You can book a free 30-minute call right there on the site. And of course, I am always releasing new music. Go to nickdamadio.com/music to find it all. My complete discography is there. All of the social links are there. And of course, please like, share, subscribe, rate, review. Do it for the podcast. Do it for the music. Sharing is especially valuable to all of us indie creators. I really appreciate your support, your eyes and ears. Thank you for hanging with me for this mid-roll, and let's get back to the show. All right, we are back, and we're going to jump right into logos from the 2000s. Modulating the message. That's the name I gave this decade. Just like with the music, the 2000s merged the subversive 1990s with the shinier 1980s, adopting styles that were both irreverent and corporate. So starting in earnest in the 1990s, though existing before where it was affordable, the ability to design digitally made it possible for far more variation within frameworks. So most of the logos are 100% computer drawn, if not maybe sketched beforehand, and geared more towards online culture than physical merch and media, though both exist. 2000, Eminem. Again, hip-hop takes the cake here. Again, minimalist, just block lettering, one color, usually black, the backwards second E, some slight variations, pretty consistent, designed by Mike Saputo. 2000-ish, 50 Cent, it's called the $half coin logo, which is really just a big minimalist 50 over top a smaller cent, often with a kind of a border, bubble border around the outside of the characters, designed by Julian Alexander and first used in some of the very late 1990s releases, meant to be featured on his shelved album, Power of the Dollar, but then used for a single in late 1999, and then just about on every release after that. Side note that solo artists, again, have rarely had logos unless they were a one-person band, which will come up more soon. But if we have any artists to thank for starting the solo artist logo trend, it's those in hip-hop. Again, bonus MxTRA, patreon.com/music is not a genre, all the solo artist visual representation, which has been quite different from bands. That said, solo artists pretty much throughout this history have resorted to maintaining an aesthetic while changing up their name for each project. This makes Rec, see my shirt, the exact hybrid that it is, largely a solo product masquerading as a sometime band, which is why I changed the logo design for each project. And stay tuned for the featured video at the end of this episode, which is the history of Rec logos, accompanied by both a newish Rec song and the story of the 20 years of Rec. What's interesting about this solo band dichotomy is that so many bands in the 2000s were driven by one prime mover that the aesthetics for those bands were more aligned with solo art than with any consistent branding. That said, let's move on to bands. 2000, Linkin Park. Lots of chatter online about the various logos, and I do really like the new Linkin Park logo, which looks like that placeholder thing in the middle of a 45 record that you have to put in when you want to play it. And fitting, because it's a very cool LP, Linkin Park. But I'm talking about the original faded, bold, all caps, vaguely Special Forces name in 4 small brackets. That one. That's pretty iconic. I forget who designed it. Was it Mike Shinoda? I don't think so. I don't know. No, 2000, Radiohead. Not a band to do anything consistently and deliberately so. Their iconic modified bear logo by Stanley Donwood in collaboration with Tom York, another band member, was first used on Kid A and has been reused and repurposed often in merch and such and online. Geometric and cute, but with menacing teeth. Meant to look like a genetically modified bear that, draws you in but scares you. Kind of like Radiohead's music. 2002, The Killers, that marquee like it's made from a bunch of little neon lights. Slick, but somehow subversive in its own way. Brandon Flowers was inspired by Elvis's #1 hits compilation cover. And then it was designed, it is said, by quote-unquote, the girlfriend of drummer Ronnie Vannucci Jr.'s roommate. That's it. Does anybody know her name? I couldn't find it. She deserves recognition. It's a great design. 2002 Deadmau5, which if you don't know, DEADMAU 5. Artists using numbers in their names is itself a form of branding, or kind of a simplified logo-y thing, similar to artists using a $sign in their names, things like that. But I'm talking about the mouse head icon, and again, it's MAU5, HEAD. Like a mascot head, but somewhat off-putting. It's designed by Joel Zimmerman, who is Deadmau5, starting in 1999, but first used in 2002. 2003, The Strokes watermark logo with a metallic chrome sheen. It's retro and modern all at once. It makes you think of a car for some reason. Designed by Warren Fu, like a sports car. 2003, Blink-182, that smiley face with the dead crossed eyes and 5 bold arrows pointing left and somewhat uppish. Very skate culture, which I'm a big fan of. Designed by Tim Armstrong of Rancid, a different band. It's great for t-shirts, very memorable. 2003, Avenged Sevenfold, the Death Bat, skull with bat wings. First designed by Micah Montague in 99 while they were still in high school, and shared through Kinko's copies at the time, but prominently first on their 2003 album, Waking the Fallen. It's often paired with a messed up, oversaturated typewriter font of their name. 2004, Kanye. The first 3 albums, I believe, at Dropout Bear. Designed by Sam Hansen and Bobby Noggle of the firm FTK. It was only used through the first 3 2000s or so, but it's pretty iconic. And you can still see versions of it online and for sale. That mascot wasn't originally planned. Kanye found the costume in a janitor's closet during a photo shoot at a New York high school. It's interesting that there were very few significant logos from the second half of the 2000s. It's probably because by then bands were on the wane and solo artists were rising up, or at least solo artists posing as bands, both. Really. And again, bonus MxTRA, patreon.com/music is not a genre, is going to talk about those solo artists. 2006, Odd Future, The Collective. That OF Donut logo was created by Tyler, the Creator. It's right there in his name. It's irreverent and memorable. It's cutesy, but somehow very, bold. It's something people would want to wear. 2007, Wreck. Our first album came out, Parts and Labor. Again, featured video at the end of this episode, and I will share the link to that video for all you audio people showing all the Wreck logos. That first album did not have the first Wreck logo, but it had the first one that made any kind of an impact. It's the Wreck Box logo. And it's also, you can find that at nickdimatteo.com/shop if you want to get it on a t-shirt. Which brings us to the next decade, 2010's Morphing the Minimalism. So the first half of this decade was a comeback for logos to some extent. What was a wilderness of where is music going, last gasp styles in the 2000s, which I actually loved that era, became more solidified as genres started to blur across the board and the industry understood more what was going to sell. And it's because of internet culture and the rise of streaming. And that was reflected also in the mixing of logo styles, too. You had hyper-clean corporate minimalism sitting right alongside more chaotic and personal statements, and all of them were easy to remember, easy to post, easy to pass around online. So number 1, 2010, Skrillex. One of the few solo people to have a distinct logo, aggressive, angular, also very minimalist, highlighting the ill in Skrillex as if it's a 3, like 3 slash marks. And those are often used by themselves and often in red. It was designed by Roboto, David de Juan Navarro. And the 2023 update, which I also freaking love, was designed by Paul Nicholson, who did the Aphex Twin. Amazing, amazing logo. You can feel the design when you look at it. I love things that are perfectly designed. It's one of my favorite logos on every level, both of them. It takes that minimalist trend and adds just enough energy and emotion and meaning. 2010, 21 Pilots, vertical, line, dash, and slash in a circle. Nobody knows what it means. Designers, the lead singer Tyler Joseph, is kind of brilliant because it's abstract, but distinct enough that you associate it with the band. And like all of these that I've mentioned, so they many of them anyway, they take that Chicago template, which is they keep the general shape and idea, but they modify the color and style every so often for various reasons. Which, side note, the logo being a distinctly designed version of a band name is called a word mark. And I did a history of like Rex logos online. I had, AI write it just to see what it would say. And they use the word mark a lot. It contains no other graphic but the letters. It's called a word mark. 2010, Imagine Dragons. Clean, geometric, slightly gothic, both direct and mysterious. More corporate than subversive. Just like the music, I don't know the designer. Number 2012, Churches. That's churches with a V instead of a U. Again, really clean and minimalist. So many of these are minimalist. Designed by Amy Burrows. The V made it easier to search for the name. Because if you just put Churches, how the hell are you going to find that band? So they changed the U to a V. And the V is like a Roman U. The 3, because the U and V used to be the same letter, by the way. The 3 lines for the E is another nice mark there. It's austere like their synth pop sound. 2013, the 1975 logo, designed by Samuel Burgess Johnson. It's a rectangular box, minimalist, almost looks like a book cover. Simple and easy to remember. 2013, Run the Jewels. A hand shaped like a gun snatching a chain from another hand, stylized differently for each release and in off releases, kind of like the Chicago idea. It's designed by Nick Gazin or Gazin. Many bands adopted a similar approach to Wreck, modifying the logo name for each project so that the shape was completely different too, and maybe even the colors. Arctic Monkeys, Tame Impala, the XX, Vampire Weekend did not have one single distinct logo. They changed it for each release, and didn't keep a standard shape or style. And by the second half of the decade, logos were fewer, and this set up what's been happening since then, which is 2020's farewell to forms. In a sense, this decade is a combination of the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and 2010s. Why? Because it takes the corporate 80s approach, adds a huge helping of the subversive anti-logo, anti-sales of the 90s, shapes everything like the branding aesthetic collection of the 2000s, and keeps the 2010s minimalism. This is not surprising since this decade's music is also a mix of all those decades. It's kind of post-logo, post-branding, and even post-internet. in the sense that it's assuming the presence of the artist and not forcing the face of them, the visual presence of them, allowing people to search and find them and then be drawn into their aesthetic world without the need for a mark. If you're tapped into an artist's social feed or streaming profile, you don't need any other visual cue. So anything that might resemble a logo is usually super temporary, often not even lasting for a full album release, and never punched up. For these reasons, I'd argue that there have literally been no standout logos from probably the last 10 years from anywhere but legacy bands. And for that reason, I'm not going to show any logos from the 2020s. But I will mention some huge recent artists, Taylor Swift, Billie Eilish, Olivia Rodrigo, any hip-hop artist, even any band. I defy you to find a memorable logo from any of them. It's as though things have gone back to the 1960s, when the majority of bands had no logos and relied more on the members and personalities in their aesthetic world, which I'm going to say again. Since most giant artists are solo, this kind of makes sense and goes to the through line here, which is that there have been no eras when solo artists were expected to have logos. Again, the bonus MxTRA, patreon.com/music is not a genre, goes over this in detail. I also think, however, that this trend too is befitting the music trends in that artists seem afraid to make bold statements and clearly define themselves, which can be a good thing. You don't want to be so clearly defined that you're put in a box. But of course, the logo is the bold statement for any artist. Then again, there are other ways to be bold, right? And consistency of style is vastly overrated. In either case, logos in music are poised for a comeback, and my prediction is by the 2030s, you're going to see a ton of logos everywhere. So, conclusions. As I've said, I've always loved logos, both as a fan and as a designer of them. And that goes for, I'm sorry, I need to move my mic here a little bit, beyond the music world. They contain far more artistic value than they're given credit for. Keeping in mind the two main kinds of logos, word marks and symbols, each can convey meaning beyond the letters or designs. Word marks done well capture both the overall band genre and their current state of being and music. Think of any of the bands whose shapes remain consistent but aesthetics change for each release, from Chicago to 21 Pilots, and you'll understand what I'm saying. Some symbols become so iconic that we know exactly what or who they represent without any words. They're like modern-day hieroglyphics. I mean, hieroglyphics themselves were, in a sense, I won't say logos, but symbols for meaning of other things. And while few people would measure logos against the greatest works of art, I'd argue that anything that can convey that much info using that little artistic real estate is magical and transcendent. They are pop art objects with purpose. Now, I read this thing on Reddit where a fan was saying a new logo means new music. I think it was for the band Deaf Heaven or whatever. And I love this because it illustrates how important visuals are to music, and that it is that cue that, something new's coming because the logo's changed, which I hope I've helped to illustrate how important visuals are with this two-part series, of course. And this is what I practice as Rec. Along again with so many other bands, which is changing the logo for each release. And I'd say even solo artists do this, though less with logos than with design. And again, finally, bonus MxTRA, patreon.com/music is not a genre, discusses all the solo artist art. So now a quick review of the evolution of logos before we wrap here. Pre-1960s, they existed primarily as drumheads, if at all. 1960s, they dipped the toe in, but largely still optional and pretty much an afterthought for most bands. 1970s, very runic in spirit, even if not in design. They were symbols meant to mean more than the names themselves, where the logo broke out of its literal letterbox and became more visually compelling. 1980s built on this visual growth and solidified it into more of a brand and vibe than a meaningful thing. So it didn't have any ulterior motive or meaning. It was the thing itself, was very branding oriented. The height of memorable logos to me was the 1980s. Not necessarily my favorite, but the height. 1990s, as with all other things 90s, a reaction against logos, in this case. They still existed to a large enough degree, but were subversive, deliberately under-designed, often just pictures and not words. So again, just like the 90s, these logos as meaning beyond the band name harken back to the 1970s. Symbolic, but in a much more laissez-faire way. The 2000s, the digitalization, so things could be more easily replicated, more easily copied and found online, as well as all over merch. More variation of style, less consistency of form. Starting to break down. Now, think about that. just like with other digital things, it's a lot easier to manipulate them. So you could make many variations of the same logo and not be spending a ton of extra money as you would have had to do in previous eras when you had to print everything or, do it somewhere else. 2010s was kind of first a comeback of the distinctive logo, and then they kind of all disappeared. Streaming took over and kind of negated the need for visual marks. 2020s has been largely logo-less, except for legacy acts. It's focused more on the people and their aesthetic world. While I grew up loving and being inspired by 1980s logos, my favorite era, after having done this research, is surprisingly the 2010s, because I've always been into minimalism with a twist as a way to imbue meaning in the simplest design. Now, that said, that may be my favorite era, but my favorite logo, aside from legacy bands like Chili Peppers, Chicago, those are some of my big favorites, would have to be Skrillex. As artistic as logos usually are, and I'd argue need to be identifiable and memorable, we should keep in mind that for most of their existence, logos served a practical purpose. In the 1960s and 70s, they were used primarily to mark gear so bands wouldn't mix up or lose their gear at gigs. In the 1970s and 80s, they were used to help people more readily identify artists' records and merch in stores. And there's overlap for these decades, but you get it. In the 1980s and 90s, and even the 2000s, they were used to spread the word of the band through t-shirts, hats, stickers, etc., and of course to bring in more revenue. In the 2000s and early 2010s, they were like online watermarks and or indicators that were easy to remember and would pop out visually online. And in the late 2010s and 2020s, they just haven't been needed, because what purpose would a logo serve for streaming? And people are more likely to look at fashions from or inspired by their artists than they are branded merch. So I want to have the same vibe as the big sweatshirt vibe, like Billie Eilish, whatever. It's one reason why I have shifted my store at nickdimatteo.com/shop to line art more than logos, although including the shirt I'm wearing now, my rec logos and my music is not a genre logos are there. Which brings me to the featured video and song. Again, it's not strictly a song, except for you listeners. At the top of the year, I created a video on Rec's YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/@recbandnyc, that shows the evolution of Rec's logo and sketches out the band's 20-year history, accompanied by the song Linear B, Other Side, from Kite to Camden. So in just a minute, I'm going to run that here for you people watching. You'll get to see it. Or go to youtube.com/@recbandnyc to find it and watch it yourself, and subscribe there. I need some Rec subscribers on YouTube. And again, you listeners, you're better served checking this out on youtube.com/musicisnotagenre. But if you've gotten this far, the link to the video will be there in the text. And stick around, in a minute, you'll get to hear Linear B, Other Side, which is a song I think you'll enjoy. Questions? Are you into band logos? Are there some that are so burned in your memory that you can see them with your eyes closed? As I mentioned a couple times, do you feel like the logo helps you understand where the artist is coming from? Do you feel like the logo clues you into that artist's style, that artist's sound, the artist maybe change in aesthetic from one album to the next? What good logos should do? What are your favorite band logos? A. And what are your favorite logos in the world? Are you a fan of the Target logo or whatever, or the Walmart, butthole logo, whatever you want to say? Like, there are logos that are non-music that I actually really enjoy. Not those two in particular, but some others. Same for band logos. I'd love to know which logos you enjoy, or if you even never thought about logos as something to absorb and enjoy, or if you just consider them as kind of a subconscious marking of that's a product, that's a band, or whatever it is. I'd like to know the answers, your answers, to all of these questions and more, because as always, my objectives here are music, conversation, and connection. Thanks for hanging with me for part 2 of the visuals series. I don't know if I'm going to do a part 3, but I do know that I will talk to you next week.